Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to have everyone join us for the keynote address by His Grace Bishop Maximus for the 2023 St. Photios Orthodox Theological Seminary Conference. We are really blessed to have His Grace or His Eminence Bishop Maximus here with us, as well as distinguished members of the faculty, as well as visitors from all around the country, as well as our virtual audience. I'd like to quickly just take care of a couple housekeeping items. Please take a moment now to silence your cell phones. If you're joining us virtually, you don't need to do that, but the format of today's event, Bishop Maximus unfortunately wasn't able to join us in person as he had just gotten back from extensive missionary journeys to Africa, but he is joining us from Guatemala, where he's based, through Zoom. So the questions that you may have during the question and answer session at the end of the presentation, there will be one of the students will have a microphone. Please raise your hand. We'll give you the microphone. Bishop Maximus will be able to hear your question directly. If you're joining us virtually, please submit your questions by writing them to ask@spots.edu. ask@spots.edu, and then myself or another member of the staff will read the question on your behalf, and His Grace will be able to answer them. Again, I'd like to welcome everyone, and before we start with the introduction by Father Gregory, the Director of Spiritual Life, I'd like to ask His Eminence to say an opening prayer.
Enlightenest and sanctifies every man that cometh into the world, but the light of thy countenance be shined upon us, that in it we may see the unapproachable light, and guide our steps in the doing of thy commandments, through the intercessions of the most pure mother and of all thy saints. Amen.
Amen. At this point in time, I'd like to welcome Father Gregory, the Director of Spiritual Life, to give an introduction to our keynote address of Pursue Meaning in Your Life. Father,
Well, as Alexia has said, I've been asked to give some introductory comments on the theme itself and on Bishop Maximus to introduce you. Pursue meaning in your life is what we've chosen as our theme, and we kind of really grappled with how we would phrase that, and the more I thought about that, the way we phrased it is a bit of a challenge. We're challenging you to pursue meaning in your life, and that's certainly what we try to do with our students and our faculty and administration, and we'd like to extend that to those of you who aren't directly involved with the seminary to take up that challenge of pursuing meaning in your life. There are many things that people pursue in life. You know, people can pursue wealth or pursue fame or pursue fortune or pursue pleasure. The author of the book of Ecclesiastes, who by tradition is the prophet King Solomon, he pursued all of those things: wealth, pleasure, fame, fortune, knowledge for knowledge's sake. And his conclusion was that all those things were meaningless. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. So we really should seek meaning in our life. We should seek to live lives of purpose, of direction, of intentionality. And of course, as Orthodox Christians, we find that meaning within the context of the Church. The Church would say that to find meaning in its deepest and fullest sense, you have to pursue the one thing needful, which of course would be Christ. And that made me think about Metropolitan Cyprian of blessed memory, who often told us to bear in mind that we all kind of face the fundamental existential question that we all face is the choice between Christ or chaos. And so for us as Orthodox Christians, to pursue meaning in life means to pursue Christ. And we'll leave it to Bishop Maximus to expound more on the idea of pursuing meaning in life. So I'd like to say a few words about Bishop Maximus himself, about his grace, just his background and who he is. So His Grace has pastoral oversight of the missions in our church. So the Church of the Genuine Orthodox Christians of Greece have a large number of missions around the world. So Bishop Maximus is responsible for our missions in Guatemala, Cuba, Haiti, Nigeria, and Uganda. I hope I didn't miss anything there. So he's quite the missionary bishop. It's kind of an apostolic calling that he has. He currently is speaking to us from Guatemala, where he has a hermitage, the Hermitage of St. Ignatius the God-bearer, where he is the superior. In terms of his background, His Grace is a native of New Jersey. He began the monastic life in 2001, and he was a student at Holy Trinity Orthodox Seminary in Jordanville, New York, where he graduated with a Bachelor of Theology degree. He was tonsured a monk in 2002 by his elder, Metropolitan Pavlos of America, at the Monastery of the Ascension. In 2008, Metropolitan Pavlos ordained him a hierodeacon, and then in 2009 he ordained him a hieromonk at his father's parish, the parish of St. Maximus the Confessor in Owego, New York. His father is Father Thomas Moretta, proto-presbyter of our church. And Bishop Maximus was named in honor of St. Maximus the Confessor. In 2012, when he was a hieromonk, he was sent on a missionary visit to Guatemala by Metropolitan Demetrius of America, who then was Bishop of Boston. And the fruit of that was the establishment of what is now the Hermitage of St. Ignatius in Guatemala. In 2019, His Grace was elected as the titular Bishop of Pelagonia. So he serves as an assistant bishop to Metropolitan Demetrius of America. And 2020, our collaboration with Bishop Maximus really began. He came in 2020 for the feast day of our monastery, St. Gregory Palamas Monastery. So this would be at the beginning of Great Lent. The second Sunday of Great Lent is our feast day. And His Grace came with the intention of just visiting us for our feast day. Well, that's when the whole COVID crisis happened and all the stress and confusion of that time. And providentially, with travel restrictions, Guatemala closed its borders, and His Grace was ended up stranded as an exile in Etna. So we ended up having Bishop Maximus for 6 months here in Etna. And that period of time, we really grew to know and love him. And he's become very intimately and directly involved with the seminary since then. We asked him during the summer, for example, to teach a class in modern Greek, which he took up with great enthusiasm. And he has since become a very beloved teacher here at the seminary by the students. He currently teaches classes in the history of philosophy and science and religion. So His Eminence does travel extensively. He just came back from a trip from Africa, where he was working with their missions in Nigeria, Uganda, and Kenya as well, where he met up with Metropolitan Ambrose, who for many years has served our missions in Kenya and the Congo. At the end of a recent successful missionary journey to Africa, after serving a divine liturgy, His Grace proclaimed in front of a large crowd that Africa is the future of Orthodoxy. And we would hope that in addition to Africa, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean also become the future of Orthodoxy under his guidance. So, Your Grace, we wish you many more years of fruitful service to the Church, and we thank you for agreeing to speak to us today, and I'll turn the podium over to you.
Thank you very much, Father Gregory, for that introduction. Well, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Your Eminence, fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters in Christ, esteemed guests and listeners, the subject of this talk and of this conference is Pursue Meaning in Your Life. And in order to develop this theme, I'm going to have to talk about why we need to discuss the topic, because the title itself implies that either that we're not pursuing meaning in our lives, or that we don't know how to pursue meaning in our lives. And then I want to talk a little bit about what is meaning, how should we conceptualize it from an Orthodox point of view, and finally I want to give some practical suggestions as to what we can do in order to have or increase meaning in our lives. In my analysis that I'm going to give, I want to acknowledge a debt, which is to the work of Dr. John Vervaeke, who is a cognitive scientist at the University of Toronto. He's probably the leading authority, contemporary authority, on what is now called the meaning crisis. and we've become friends, and I've been talking a lot to him, and some of our conversations have been published on YouTube, on his YouTube channel, and some of our conversations have also been about the Orthodox approach to meaning, which is what we're going to talk about here. So, in the past, it would have been unnecessary to have a conference on pursuing meaning in life, because meaning in most people's lives in pre-modern societies was fairly obvious. It was created by the circumstances that people lived in. You lived close to the natural world. You had to work with your hands in order to eat. You had a family. You believed in God or in a heavenly world. You believed in eternal consequences for your behavior in this life. You shared a culture and a belief system with those around you, and that made you feel like you were part of an important whole. And all of this created meaning in people's lives, because these are natural expressions of, and we can say conditions for, human meaning. And broadly speaking, meaning results from being connected to reality and to the source of reality, which is God. And that means that the more strongly we are connected to reality and the source of reality, and the more levels on which we're connected and the more ways we're connected, the greater our sense of meaning in life. However, since the late Middle Ages, we could say, skepticism in various forms has been on the rise. And what skepticism does is it leads people to question what reality is and what actually exists, how much of reality actually exists. And if you trace the history of Western thought, and of course all of us live in the Western world, and moreover the Western world is basically the dominant world culture, and everybody, even those who come from other cultures, are now affected by and really participating in Western culture. If you trace out the history of Western thought, beginning approximately, let's say in the 14th century with nominalism, the first type of skepticism, which really gained hold on the Western intellectual world, you trace it through the Protestant Reformation, which was another form of skepticism, we could say, about the church, another form of individual views on first on the Bible and then broadly about what we are doing with our lives. Then you go through the Enlightenment. You go through the rise of science, the rise of technology, which profoundly altered the way that people live. All of this culminating in the postmodern movement that we're living through now. And in postmodernism, truth is subjective. Everything is relative. And this has created a crisis of meaning, which is unprecedented in human history. Now, what does that mean? No pun intended. What is the practical result of all that, of this intellectual history, which I just traced out very, very broadly, but which anyone who is interested in understanding in more depth, there are plenty of materials to read or to listen to online in order to understand how that happened. In our modern world, our contemporary world that we're living in right now, and we could say with increasing intensity over the past 20 years, we see that there are measurable and undeniable symptoms of an almost total loss of meaning. And that's taking place both on the personal level and on the level of society. So I'm going to give you some examples, and this is not an exhaustive list, but it's pretty horrifying. We see a massive increase in depression, increase in pill taking, increase in illegal drugs and addiction. We see an increase in psychological disorders, especially among the youth. Increase in despair, increase in suicide rates, increase in loneliness, a decrease in the number of close friends that people have, people that they trust and that they can really talk to. Instead, we see close friendships being substituted with casual contacts online through social media. We see a sexualization of society, which is both based on fleeting physical pleasure, which is a kind of poor substitute for actual meaning. And that leads to what's called hookup culture. In other words, where instead of establishing long-lasting bonds of marriage with a partner, you end up just having a very casual relationship, a casual sexual relationship with someone you don't even know. We see a rise in pathological ideologies, and these ideologies are trying to fill a vacuum that is being left by the decrease in religion. Of course, the problem with ideologies is that they have part of the or they offer part of what religion offers, but not the totality. So they're kind of like a parasitical imitation of religion. Fascism, for example, we saw in the 20th century communism. Nowadays, we're seeing postmodernism. We see it with the new fad of gender ideology. You can be certain that that in a few years there's going to be some other crazy ideology that's going to pop up, and everybody's going to think that it's the greatest thing. We see an increased detachment from reality, in other words, from physical reality. We see it especially with the internet, people living in video games, living online. The virtual world for many people is more important than the actual real world, because you can make yourself be anything. There's a loss of a generally believed narrative in society. In other words, nobody knows what the purpose of society is. There's no commonality between people. And that, of course, contributes to a breakdown of society, a fragmentation of society into different interest groups. And those interest groups, we see them on the political level, and we also see them on the cultural level. And these groups, of course, because they're fragmented and they have no common basis of belief in reality, because skepticism in its various forms has taken over everything, relativism has taken over anything, so they end up talking past each other or speaking across each other. So society ends up becoming superficial. We see other manifestations like art and architecture that are horrible and inhuman and ugly, and they're specifically designed to be that way by the artists and architects in order to express the nonsense and meaninglessness that they perceive the world to be. So that's a pretty grim description of our modern world, but it's absolutely backed up by solid scientific data. There are many studies about all of these different phenomena that I've mentioned. And apart from that, I think it's obvious to all of us that this is the case. We live in this world. If we have our eyes open, we're seeing that this is the way things are. And even for people who don't perceive these things explicitly, they can sense that something is off. Something is off with the modern world. Now, we who are part of the church are insulated to a certain extent from the worst effects of the meaning crisis. But all of us have been damaged by it, and all of us have been affected by it. So, what then is meaning, and how do we have it? In order to get a good idea, or some sort of idea, of how we can have meaning in our lives, when the entire structure and the thought world of society has been militating against it, both explicitly for decades and maybe implicitly for centuries, let's look at what meaning in life really is. We can say that meaning is connected to a sense of reality. It's connected to a belief in the importance of what one is doing, that what one is doing really matters. It's connected, it has to do with a sense of interconnectedness between ourselves, between our activities, between the world around us. It has to do with a participation in something higher or something greater than oneself. And it has to do with a sense of purpose, or what in philosophical terms we would call a teleology. So all of these things imply that meaning in life increases the more that one moves away from skeptical nihilism, and the more that one moves towards what we could call religious realism. Now, if we examine the word itself, the word meaning, let's say etymologically, in English, the meaning, no pun intended, is a little bit obscured. If we look in Greek or in the Latin languages, it's a little bit clearer. In Greek, we would say σημαίνω, σημασία, and Latin significare. And in the Latin languages, derived words. So we can break it down. We can break it down in two ways. Firstly, meaning is the intent to signify something. In other words, to symbolize or to represent something else. And usually this is going to refer to the material world and our action in it. And then perhaps on a higher level, the ways in which the material world can somehow represent the transcendent world. And the second meaning of meaning, or let's say definition of meaning, is the purpose or goal, that is intent, which implies a kind of motion towards something. Now, in the context that we're speaking about here, we mean motion towards or having as a goal something higher, something better. And this would be something that's implicitly at least transcendent, and that this is the highest or the best thing. So, what that means is that to have meaning, we need to be working towards a goal that is absolute. Or, to put it another way, to the extent that we understand our actions as working within a structure that has an absolute basis and that ultimately refers to something beyond itself, we will increase our possibility for meaning in our lives. On the other hand, if our goals are self-invented, or if they're somehow provisional, then let's say our house, the house of our life, is built on sand. It's only if our ultimate goal-oriented structure is absolute is when it is built on rock, to invoke the gospel image. Now, you really can't prove rationally the existence of this rock, in other words, of this absolute meaning, because it transcends reason. You have to accept it on faith, and that is something that is not irrational or stupid or just believing in fairy tales. Rather, it is something that is wise to do, because it's the only way to have full meaning and make sense out of the world. In other words, you have to choose whether you want to believe that your life has ultimate meaning, or whether meaning is just something that you invent for yourself, which is, of course, the popular idea in our culture. Now, the fact that religious people do believe firmly and in something that is absolute, which grounds everything that we do in our lives, that is part of the reason why religious people are happier and more fulfilled than irreligious people. It also has to do with the practices that religious people have. Now, the current meaning crisis has been precipitated by a denial of more and more reality. And an ever-increasing skepticism, and we could say that this has been potentiated by the increasingly artificial technology, which removes us from our physical reality and facilitates living in a fantasy. So what this means is that the most important way to alleviate the meaning crisis, and for us to have meaning in our own lives, is first of all to affirm reality and the source of reality, which is God. And the more of reality that we affirm, the greater our potential for a sense of meaning in life that it provides. And that potential then can be realized by participating in reality. And I'm going to talk about how exactly we participate in reality. But I want to note the connection between the two senses of meaning that I talked about. On the one hand, we have a purpose in our mind for our symbols, and we also express our intentions symbolically. Now, it has to be admitted that simply having a transcendent framework, like I just outlined, is not actually enough for us to have meaning in our lives. And the reason for that is that the specific meaning for each person has to be made concrete in an individual manner. And that's inevitably going to vary from person to person because people are different. So in other words, what's some practice or activity that I have that's meaningful for me may not be meaningful for another person, and vice versa. But they're still going to be meaningful in the correct way if they are subsumed within the proper framework of reality and a goal or purpose or intent towards the transcendent absolute. Now we can think of this. There's actually two parts to meaning. In this sense, we can think of them as the vertical axis and the horizontal axis. This is the way that I think of it, at least. So we have the vertical axis, which is basically like ascent up towards God or ascent towards some sort of higher purpose. It's basically motion. You can think of it as a narrative. You can think of it as growth. In other words, whenever we're trying to make progress in something in our lives, and ultimately that progress, the ultimate progress, is towards God. And then there's another axis, which is, you could say, more at rest. It doesn't involve so much a narrative as more our own personal realization of what's relevant and interesting to ourselves. And both of these are necessary for our proper relationship to the world. Positive emotion, which is, of course, part of meaning. If we have meaning in our lives, we're going to have positive emotion. However, whatever kind of positive emotion you want to think that as, happiness, contentment, satisfaction, fulfillment, really comes from two sources. On the one hand, when we feel positive emotion, or we could say meaning, when we see ourselves making progress towards a goal. And psychologists have pointed out that it's not the positive emotion that we have is not actually the so much in the accomplishment of the goal as in seeing ourselves making progress toward the goal. And so again, that's thinking of it as the vertical axis, moving towards something good. And then there's another type of positive emotion, which is just being in a good state, being in a good situation, simply enjoying goodness and rightness. When something is right in your life, you're just doing the right thing and you feel that it's right for you. So these are two different parts of meaning, and I think both of them are necessary for us to have a proper and complete picture of how to have meaning in our lives. Now, of course, from the Orthodox Christian point of view, all of this leads finally to the union with God, because God is the grounding of reality. And there's actually, according to the Father, there's a way of reconciling these two elements, these two parts of meaning. In other words, the one part that's motion towards a goal, the other part that's realizing what's of interest to you and just enjoying a good state. And that's an idea that is expressed by St. Gregory of Nyssa called epektasis. In other words, the infinite extending out into God. God is both the destination and he's the way. He's both the goal and the progress. And I don't want to get too much into the theology here because it's going to take us off into another topic. But I would want to note, incidentally, that really the union of these two principles and the union of any two principles that are in a relationship like this actually occurs through the union of the two natures in Christ, the divine and the human joining together. So really the proper relationship of all reality is through Christ and modeled after Christ. So that gives us these two axes, the vertical axis of the striving towards the good and ultimately towards the absolute good, and then realizing what is personally relevant to us as individuals. This forms the basic structure of what we're going to have as meaning. But there's another element that needs to be brought in, or maybe two other elements. And that is, there has to be a moral framework, one, and two, there has to be a hierarchy of what is more or less meaningful, because not all things are equally meaningful for us. So if we don't have the moral framework, what we perceive as meaningful for us will actually be nothing more than an amoral positive state. There's a phenomenon called flow that a lot of psychologists are talking about now, where you get caught up in the moment and you're really involved so that you lose track of other things, and it's a really fulfilling state. And flow is actually positively connected with meaning. The problem is that something like flow is actually morally neutral. And in connected with that, there's a kind of meaning which is also morally neutral, or which could actually be evil. So for example, Stalin apparently found meaning in killing millions of people. Hitler apparently found meaning in, plotting the conquest of Europe and the enslavement of entire nations and races and their extermination. So people can find meaning in evil things, and obviously this is not the route that we want to go down. It's a kind of perversion. And likewise, if we're going to talk about a hierarchy of more or less meaningful, we need to realize that some things are more meaningful than others, and what is more meaningful ultimately is going to be connected with reality in a more intense and profound way. So, for example, I don't know if this is a good example, but let's say I'm shoveling my driveway. There's snow there, I'm getting it out. I find it meaningful to a certain extent because, well, first of all, it allows me to get my car out. And then secondly, it's a little bit of physical exercise, a little bit of movement, which is fulfilling. There's a certain amount of fulfillment that comes just from getting a task done. Maybe I like the way that the snow packs down or something like this. It could be meaningful for me. Now, it might be drudgery for some people as well. But if it is meaningful for me, it's on, a rather low level. Whereas, for example, if I were to save someone's life, or maybe if I were even to risk my own life to save someone else's life, let's say I were going to jump into a river in order to save someone who's drowning, that would be much more meaningful to me. And the reason, of course, is that a human life is of much greater value than, say, moving snow. And there is a greater interconnection with reality and with the source of reality, because, of course, humans are the greatest, most complex things that we know of, and of course, we believe that we have an eternal soul and eternal value before God. So we can see how there is a hierarchy of more or less meaningful, and the way that each of these can relate to the intensity of the connection with reality, and to the number of interconnections with reality, and so forth. So what this means basically is that your personal interests, which are certainly a necessary part of leading a meaningful life, need to be sorted and they need to be prioritized. And this sorting and prioritization basically is the function of what we call wisdom. We need wisdom in order to get us to a better understanding of how to avoid meaningless thoughts, irrelevant situations, basically delusion, how to avoid going down the wrong path to something that seems to be meaningful to us, but actually is going to cause a problem later. And this wisdom of how to sort out and prioritize apparently meaningful things in our lives within a moral framework, within a hierarchy of more or less meaningful, we find this in the fathers of the church. We also find this on a lower level in classical education. Reading the best authors of antiquity and throughout history, we can gain wisdom and insight into how to properly prioritize, sort through, and perceive the elements in our lives which can be meaningful to us. So, to arrive at the best and the truest meaning, we need a moral framework, we need a hierarchy, and to bring it back to the first point, both of these point to something beyond our perception of meaning, which sustains and embeds the meaning, which, of course, ultimately is going to be God. All right. So that was a pretty intense and very compacted explanation of what we could call the philosophical or theological framework and definition of meaning. So, how do we take all that theory and put it into practice into our lives so that we actually feel like we're leading meaningful lives? Since the loss of meaning in the lives of modern people is ultimately the result of skepticism and the result of detachment from reality or denial of reality, the first step and the most assured step to take, to begin at least, in order to have meaning in our lives, is we need to reject skepticism. And rejecting skepticism means having faith, because faith is the opposite of skepticism. Of course, we who are Christians, we who are Orthodox Christians, when we understand faith, we can understand it maybe on a smaller level, a lower level of just faith in the structure of reality, that reality, what we understand as reality is in fact real. But more importantly, of course, faith in God and faith in the teachings of the church, which give us the proper perspective in order to understand reality and our interconnection with it, and especially the source. So basically, we are affirming through faith, we are affirming and we are reconnecting with reality, and especially the source of reality, which is God. So on a practical level, what does this mean? It means having a real, a firm, an unbreakable, and a living faith in God. An absolute faith that our life actually has eternal, transcendent value, and that what we are doing, really everything that we are doing, matters in the most complete and full sense. Now, that naturally leads to belonging to a community where this faith can be realized and acted out. This community, of course, is precisely the church. And we should note here in this context that the Orthodox Church both affirms the right relationships between God and man in the world in the best way possible, and also that historically it was the departure from Orthodoxy that started the West down the path to where we are now. Not only does the church connect us to reality, but even more importantly, it connects us to the source of reality, which is God. And the church offers us every level of connecting to reality and to the beyond. And I'm going to give some examples here according to categories, which I'm actually taking from the work of Dr. Jean Vervaeke, but which I think are very orthodox in their conception. There is the propositional level, which we would understand propositions as referring to doctrines and dogmas and canons and rules. We need these in order to give us a certain structure of what do we believe and what don't we believe, and what do we do and what don't we do. If you don't have that structure, then you have chaos. Now there's what could be called the procedural aspect of connecting to reality, which would be in the context of the church. There's reading, spiritual reading, there's chanting, there's the whole ritual of the church. We have iconography and so forth, and we have candles, we have incense, we have relics, we have censing. All of these are physical practices which we can do, making the sign of the cross and bowing and making prostrations. These are physical things that we can do, that we can perceive, that we can participate in. They are symbols of divine things, and they are symbols of the relationship between us and the world and the divine. And they allow us to participate in the higher levels of reality, not so much intellectually as on a more subconscious or perhaps we could say emotional level. Then there's what we could call the perspectival aspect, which means how we are orienting ourselves and what our mindset is in order to achieve all these things that we've been talking about. So we have in the Orthodox Church, we have the ascetic and monastic theology, the writings of the fathers on the spiritual life, this huge wealth of Orthodox writings which can help guide us towards a proper Christian life, which ultimately is the life which is the most real life. And then finally, there's what we could call the participatory aspect. And maybe this is the most important aspect, where we have Christian living, we have participation in parish community. On a personal level, we're trying to acquire the virtues. We understand the acquisition of the virtues and the participation in the sacraments and in Christian life as being a participation in the life of Christ. We are trying to love each other. And perhaps when we are going in the right direction, we can receive divine grace. And that divine grace is actually a participation in God. And then ultimately there are the higher levels of participation in God, which the fathers call illumination and deification. Now, it's not necessary to go into those higher levels, but all of these things that I just described are ways of truly living a meaningful life through connection with reality and the source of reality which are offered by the Orthodox Church. And if you'll allow me a little plug here, I would say that that all of these elements that I just described are what are taught and what are practiced here at the Seminary of St. Photios. So apart from the meaning that we find in the strict context of the church, there are also many other aspects of the human person that need to be engaged in or engaged with for us to feel like we're fulfilled. And these can be obtained from secular sources, sources that are outside the church, which are nevertheless expressions of the truth, and they are forms of participation in reality on a lower but absolutely necessary level. And the reason for that is because we as human beings are composed of both the higher and the lower. And all of this is God's plan, God's providence. Both the higher and the lower aspects of humanity and and the universe are God's creation, and ultimately they are expressions of God's love, and they glorify God through their existence. So we should not despise the lower aspects. We really need the lower aspects as well. So let's go through a few of these aspects. We can talk about the intellectual part of man. This is, of course, appropriate here in the context of the seminary. I would say that the intellectual part of humans, which does not apply just to academics, there's a certain part of it which can apply to most people, and I think this would mean something like a classical education. In other words, the classical education which was developed in ancient Greece and Rome with great authors and great literature, and which to a certain extent was extended and continued with great thinkers, great writers, great artists throughout the centuries. And what we consider to be classical education really expresses the best of human thought and human spirit. It's also been tested by time, because we're talking about a form of education which has lasted for more than 2,000 years, and moreover, it is accepted by the church as the best form of worldly education. Most of the fathers of the church had classical education, and here at St. Photios Seminary, apart from the strictly theological courses, the seminary also offers a curriculum which is broadly based on the classical tradition. Now, of course, we don't have just the spiritual, which was the first part we talked about, nor just the intellectual. We also have the physical part. We need some sort of physical activity. And in the pre-modern world, this would have been provided naturally to a great extent just by the physical work that people would have done. But in the modern world, in our modern context, I think we can find a legitimate expression of it through various forms of sport, through exercise, because by taking appropriate, although not excessive, care of the body, we show respect for ourselves, we show respect for God's creation, and I don't have to enumerate for you all of the physical and health and psychological benefits that come from keeping one's body active and in good health. We also need some sort of creative outlet. We can call it art, but in the broadest, the ancient sense. Not just painting something or making a sculpture, but all in the sense of just of any sort of making, which is engaging the imagination, because although there are in the spiritual life, we try to restrict the use of the imagination. Nevertheless, in our worldly life, we know that the imagination is a faculty created by God, which is necessary for us to function. We're engaging the imagination with making something, and this is a beautiful thing. It's a necessary thing, which many people find meaning and fulfillment in, and it is something. It is part of our nature, which is created by God, and actually J.R.R. Tolkien calls this subcreation. He has this idea that because we are created in the image and likeness of God, and God is a creator, that therefore we can be sub-creators, and that this is part of our part of who we are as human beings. We also need real friendships, because humans are social creatures. We need to live in community. We need to have friendships which are deep. We need to have people that we can trust, that we can talk to, have real, deep, meaningful conversations. And we would say that the fact that humans are social creatures and we need this social, positive, good, real social interaction, that this is ultimately a reflection of the Holy Trinity. Because in the Holy Trinity, God is one, and yet there is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And perhaps most importantly, we need family. We need deep, loving, lasting family bonds. And this love that exists within a family is a kind of symbol, and it's a foretaste of God's love for us, and it's a model of how we should love God. It's an example that gives an idea. If we feel this such love for our spouse or for our children, how much more should we feel love for God, our Creator? And of course, St. Paul talks about this and explains this as a kind of model. And we know that this family, the love that's found in a family, the relationship which is found in a family, is most perfectly found in Christian marriage and having children within the context of a Christian marriage. And finally, we should try to limit and control our interaction with the modern world on a kind of physical level. If, as we've stated, meaning is connected to our participation in reality, to the extent that we are able to disengage from the digital and the virtual world and return to interacting with the natural world, we'll create a kind of space for the possibility of increasing meaning in our lives. I'm not saying that it automatically is going to give us more meaning or make us happier, but it affords us that possibility. So just for example, we can try to spend time in nature, taking walks or hikes in the forests, or just sitting out and enjoying the air or the sunset. We could try to eat natural foods rather than the processed poison, which is often what we buy in the supermarkets. We could try to have, let's say, natural furniture, wooden furniture, rather than just plastic junk all over our house. We could have physical books rather than just reading everything online. Maybe a hobby that involves doing something with your hands, and so on. I would say here that the internet, or maybe the virtual world that increasingly is the way that we use the internet, I would say that we should view it as something like a drug. In other words, a drug is something that's useful in very small, controlled doses under specific circumstances, but it can never be the basis of our mode for existing. Otherwise, we'll destroy ourselves. I think that's a it's a useful way to view the internet. We need it. We're using the internet right now, but it has to be in small doses and in a controlled manner. So these, what I'm offering here, these suggestions, they're not hard or fast rules. Everybody's personality is different. Everybody's situation is different, and different things are going to work for different people. But these are maybe some ideas that can get you thinking about what you could do in your own life that would help you to create the possibility for greater meaning. In other words, there are examples of things that can help us live better. So to conclude, while we cannot avoid being affected by the culture around us that both explicitly and implicitly is attempting to undermine the meaning in our lives, we can, as Orthodox Christians, take real steps to think, to act, and to live in such a way that our lives are truly meaningful. And despite all of the obstacles, nothing can prevent us, nothing can stop us from having a meaningful life if we want to. A life of proper orientation towards God and the highest things. A life of virtue, a life of goodness, of truth, of beauty, which ultimately is the prelude and the entry point into the eternal and the divine life. So my prayer for all of you is that you will have this meaning in your life, true meaning, by the grace of our Savior, Jesus Christ. So thank you very much, and God bless you all.
Thank you, Your Grace, for this presentation. I think there's some feedback going on. Okay, that's been solved. At this point in time, I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and Timothy will hand you the microphone. Well, while we're formulating questions here from the audience, I'd just like to share with you, Your Grace, that I personally find great meaning in starting the day with a cup of coffee. And in particular, a particular brand of coffee, I think, in fact, that's shared with multiple people here in the room. I don't know if, yes, so San Ignacio coffee. Could you speak a little bit about that while people are still thinking of their questions?
Well, thank you, Alexei, for bringing that up. Here in Guatemala, in our Hermitage of St. Ignatius, we have a coffee farm that surrounds the monastery. It's not too big, but we are now, by God's grace, exporting coffee to the United States, and we have our own brand, which is San Ignacio coffee. And you can order it online. It's pretty good coffee. I think I'm being honest when I say that it's pretty good coffee. It's grown at a height of almost 5,000 feet in volcanic soil. And you can order it online at the website for San Ignacio Coffee. And I would encourage all of you to buy as much as you can, or convert your coffee habit into our buying our coffee, because we're trying to support not just the monastery of St. Ignatius, but actually a lot of the work that we're doing in Latin America and Africa, and many of the different activities that I'm involved in. We're trying to fund this by means of the coffee. So right now, such a shoestring budget. It's if I told you the numbers, you would all laugh. Of course, if we're able to make the sale of the coffee successful, this will help us to be more productive, be more efficient, and do more things, both for the life of the church, and, God willing, maybe also afford me a little bit more opportunity to participate in activities like this. So I would really encourage you all to buy the coffee and to enjoy it.
Your Grace, what I got from that is that active participation in one of the lower things, such as drinking coffee, actually has meaning in the higher things, as your missionary work and the growth of the church. Is that?
Well, that's a perfect example of interconnectedness. You need that coffee to give you the boost to start the day, and I'm not saying that's wrong. Actually, I'm encouraging you to do it because because that's the business. And a lot of people do find a certain meaning obviously on a lower level of that coffee. For some people it's almost a ritual. You start it out in the morning and you have your coffee and you enjoy it. It's relaxing at the same time as it stimulates you to get the day going. So and a lot of people couldn't get through the day without that. It's really something important to them. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's really nothing wrong with that. And in this particular context, of course, by doing so, you're actually supporting something that's higher. So yes, you're right. You're right on target, Alexei.
To remind our online audience that they can submit questions by writing an email to ask@spots.edu, and then we'll read those questions out to Your Grace. Are there any questions in the audience? Yes, we have a question in the back. Tatiana?
Evlikita, Your Grace, thank you for the lovely presentation. I was wondering how I can help guide my friends who aren't in the Christian faith in pursuing meaning in their life when they are seeking.
Well, of course, it would depend on the individual. Everybody's at a different place. Probably it's not constructive to begin directly with what we might think of the highest things, or just tell them become Orthodox and that's going to give you meaning in your life, because actually it won't if it's not properly practiced. That's why in Orthodoxy we don't just talk about orthodoxy, correct belief, we also talk about orthopraxy, correct practice. So it may be, depending on where the person is coming from, if you start talking to them directly about Orthodoxy, you're not going to get anywhere. They're just going to shut you down or tune you out. But if you talk about something that's maybe a little bit lower, a little bit more accessible, and then tie that into the idea of how our connectedness to what's real and how our faith in that there is some real purpose, real ultimate meaning to life. I think that's the best way to talk to people in general. And that entry point could be really anything. Maybe if you know the person well, you would know what kind of things are interesting to them, or what might be interesting to them, and try to tie it into the larger picture. And then depending on their own development and their own receptivity, you can gradually introduce the higher elements, which ultimately provide a deeper sense of meaning. So that's how I would go about it. I don't know if that's the best way, but it seems to me that would be the best approach.
Thank you, Your Grace. Are there any other questions? Yes, Philaret, we have a question.
Would you say that pursuing meaning in your life, would you say that is the same or similar to doing everything in your life to the glory of God? Or a means to that? I said that correctly.
Well, I wouldn't say that they are identical, but I would say that the one is ensconced within the other. In other words, when you say do everything for the glory of God, you are referring to what I was to the central point that I was making about how we need a purpose, an ultimate purpose, and that there has to be a kind of ultimate goal towards what we're doing. And of course, that is God, and we could say for the glory of God. That's what I was referring to as the vertical axis. But there is this other part, which is just how that plays out on a personal level, and different things are relevant to different people. And that's going to vary. So, but what I would call, what I call the horizontal axis, in other words, the personal relevance or interest, which is really important. You can't have meaning without that part in your life. That needs to be ensconced within the higher vision of ascending upwards, which ultimately is for the glory of God. But for the, how can you say, because it's such a large picture, the interconnectedness between them is not always immediately evident, even if it's ultimately rooted in what we would call the glory of God. So I guess it depends on how you're conceiving of it. In the ultimate sense, yes, what you're saying is true. But on a more practical level, it can, it's not always immediately apparent. Now, that being said, I think for us as Christians, we should try in a conscious manner to do everything for the glory of God. In other words, whatever kind of work we're doing, whatever sort of activity we're doing, to dedicate it to God, to devote it to God, and to place it in God's hands. And I think that's a very beautiful, correctly oriented, and humble way of approaching life.
Thank you. We have two questions up here in the audience. Nathan?
I was wondering, how can a classical and theological education practically serve us in the various secular or different professions or lower level meaning that we pursue in life?
Well, that's kind of two questions, actually. I guess your one part is just getting a degree. Of course, if you have a degree from an accredited college, that's sometimes a requisite for certain jobs, or for pursuing other educational opportunities. A classical education, a proper classical education, is going to teach you how to think right, how to separate out right from wrong, and it's the pursuit of wisdom, as I was talking about, avoiding delusion, thinking clearly, also speaking clearly. And these are skills which are universally applicable in any sort of job, in any sort of activity, to the extent that you're able to speak clearly, think clearly, write clearly, and have a broad vision and understanding of the world, of history, culture, literature, and so forth. That's going to allow you to assess any situation in a proper manner. It will certainly give you an edge over other people who don't have that background, who are not able to think clearly, who have all sorts of jumbled ideas in their mind. So the classical education really is the best preparation for life on almost every level, apart from the the very strictly spiritual, and I would say even for the very strictly spiritual, it's a useful background. Let's see, your second part of your question was about how that can affect or help you to realize the meaning on some of the lower levels. Well, I think some of the same logic applies. It can just give you a better perspective on really who you are and what works for you, in a way that allows you to avoid self-deception, so that basically you're not going to be wasting your time and doing something stupid that you regret later. You're going to be practicing something that really does provide some sort of fulfillment in your life, and even on this lower level, this practical level, even if it's just a hobby, or maybe it will help you to choose your job better. And of course, work for many people is a source of great meaning and fulfillment, and that is as it ought to be. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's how I would view it.
Thank you. At this point in time, I'd like to read our first question from our online audience. They write, "I'm curious if His Grace can speak more about how the classics are rooted in understanding of the world through the perspective of the Bible, and how modern educational thought is a direct denial of this. Where exactly is this never-ending innovation rooted?"
Again, I think that's two questions. If we think about the classical tradition as it developed, it was really the union of two elements. One element was the Greco-Roman tradition, which provided much of, let's say, the intellectual part of the education, and then there was the other part was the biblical tradition, both the Old and the New Testament, which provided the spiritual part, and the two ended up influencing each other in various ways. The result of the union between the two, and of course we as Christians would always consider the biblical part to be the superior part, to which any sort of external elements need to be subordinated. The union of these two is ultimately the creation of Christian civilization, and we could say Orthodox civilization. Now, once that was created, and that was the common basis of the whole Christian world for many hundreds of years, which in the Orthodox Church we still preserve, or we try to preserve at least, we find in the West a gradual deviation from this, and we can trace it historically, starting with the Carolingians and their introduction of the filioque into the creed, which they had to justify by coming up with a new theory of progress in theology. This idea of progress then got very rooted within the West, and progress inevitably means change. Now, it's not that we're saying that change is bad, or that progress in some sense is bad. You always need to be able to adapt to new situations. Otherwise, you're going to become ossified and just break. But this idea of almost like progress for progress's sake became deeply rooted in the West, and we see how it led to throughout the Middle Ages to progress in philosophy, progress in science, and now progress in contemporary life. Progress is basically a slogan which is used to justify the most radical and and ridiculous of changes, as if they were somehow good in themselves simply because they are quote unquote progress. So to go through the whole intellectual history of the West, that would take a long time, and it's been done by different scholars in different ways. Some of them Orthodox, some of them not Orthodox. It's no secret, but in the Orthodox Church, we try to preserve the original, what we can think of as the original synthesis between Greco-Roman civilization and the Bible or Christianity, which is really it's the truth. It's the best way to view reality, the world, God, and our place in all of this.
Thank you, Your Grace. I believe there was a question up at the front, and then we had some questions in the back. So, Vasilios?
Okay, I had a question, Your Grace. Thank you for the very edifying talk. I was wondering, so you said at the beginning that vanity of vanities, so the things that we shouldn't necessarily pursue as a source of meaning, like something that would, bring profit to you or pleasure or something. But then later on in the talk, you said that, there are certain times where you can find meaning in these kinds of things. But so could you classify how would you, in day-to-day life, kind of separate those? Because you do have to live in the world, and sometimes, as humans, we're what's the word? We don't have that certain filter. It's not built in. So how can we kind of remind ourselves not to get pulled into those things that are not as important, I guess?
Actually, it was Father Gregory in his introduction who was talking about vanity of vanities and the pursuit of wealth and so forth as being false avenues of meaning. Of course, he's correct. I didn't directly touch on that just because the topic is so huge and there's not enough time to talk about everything. But that would be an example of a false kind of meaning. When I mentioned that meaning has to be understood within a moral framework. Otherwise, we're going to fall into self-deception. And there are so many false avenues of meaning out there. The pursuit of wealth, obviously, is one of those. Now, of course, that does not mean that one should not try to make a living or make money. Obviously it's necessary in order to live in the world. One could even find some level of fulfillment in making money. And I wouldn't say that that's necessarily bad in and of itself. The problem is when that becomes, when the making of money, to use this example, becomes the goal in and of itself, rather than a means for something better. So sure, we need to make money. And if there are people who make a lot of money, it would be, of course, for us as Christians, it would have to be made in an ethical way. In other words, not by stealing, not by lying, not by cheating, and so forth. By treating, say you're a business owner, by treating your workers well in a Christian manner, with love and justice. But then the question arises: well, what is the purpose of that, making that money? The money itself is just a means to an end. What is the end? Is the end going to be our pride? Is the end going to be this idea of just accumulating and accumulating, which is itself a perversion of of a true principle. Every vice ultimately is a perversion of a true principle. So it would be a perversion, say, of the idea of continual progress towards the good, or the accumulation of virtue. And then what are you going to do with all that money? Well, of course, if the proper way to use money, if one is able to gain it, would be for some good purpose. So for example, helping out the seminary with its expansion project, that would be a great use of money. That would be meaningful both for oneself, because one is contributing towards something which is actually truly good, which participates in the ultimate good. And that participation in that true and ultimate good does create more meaning for oneself than just hoarding the money or using it to support one's own life of vices. So everything, any sort of worldly activity it can be used, can be directed towards the good, or it can be directed towards evil. So we need to have the wisdom, the discernment, in order to know which is the correct way to relate to and act with respect to these worldly necessary worldly endeavors, which are not sinful in and of themselves, but which can be used either virtuously or sinfully. And in order to have that wisdom, as I had mentioned, we can find this in the church and the fathers of the church, in the living life of the church. Talking with people in the church who have some experience and wisdom, and also just in the general formation of the human character, which we can get, at least in part, through some sort of classically oriented education. So that's how I would say that we should look at those sorts of things.
Alexi, I believe you've been waiting patiently.
Thank you, Your Grace, for the wonderful talk. I really enjoyed what you said about the wisdom of finding meaning in a hierarchy and the fullness of the Orthodox view, but in discerning that, and you said the leap of faith, and this is, how do you discern the difference of other philosophies that find meaning through different wisdom instead of the fullness of the hierarchy? Maybe, for example, detachment and simplifying and finding meaning in that, or just other philosophies that deal with meaning through different roots of simplicity, maybe instead of complexity and fullness. I don't know if that makes sense. And that's my question.
Well, it depends. Because there are of course many different philosophies out there, many different what we could call wisdom traditions, and some of what they teach is, of course, foreign to orthodoxy, but some of what they teach is does not contradict anything to the Orthodox Church, even if it might have a particular emphasis, that we don't directly talk about in Orthodoxy. And I think when you get to that part, this is where we're talking about something that's maybe a little bit of a lower level, which is not strictly, in the most strict sense, the spiritual life, but which could refer to, our more general, we could say spiritual in the, I can say, in a kind of a lower sense of the word, in the sense of, I don't know what the right word is, the full expression of and best way to act out one's own personality and personal existence. So something like, I don't know, you mentioned like minimalism or something like this. There's nothing in a philosophy like minimalism. We can say it's a kind of sub-philosophy. In other words, it doesn't explain the totality of existence. It's just a way of looking at some parts of existence and some parts of our life, and maybe that's what's good for you. This is where we get on the level of, let's say, personal realization, which is different for each person. And if something like a minimalist attitude towards life is what works for you, and I don't think it's something that if done within the context of a broader Orthodox framework necessarily contradicts anything Orthodox, then more power to you. That's perfectly fine. If that's what works for you, then go for it. Does that answer the question? I'm not sure if I got exactly.
Yeah, thank you. That it did answer it in a way. I think I have to think through my question a bit more myself, but it does. It definitely does. So thank you.
Are there any other questions before we wrap up? Any final questions from our online audience? Now is your chance to send them to ask@spots.edu. While we're waiting for anybody to send in a question, Your Grace, I wanted to ask, probably on behalf of a lot of us here in the room that have been following your conversation with Dr. John Vervaeke. I understand the first video that was posted now has over 26,000 views. And you've had a follow-up. How many more videos can you share with us how many more conversations are in the works? I know many of the students have been watching them, so maybe you could share with this audience a little bit about that.
We've released 2 conversations so far. We have a 3rd conversation which is already recorded, but not yet released, and then we have a 4th conversation which is planned, but we're still fixing down the date for it. But probably that'll be pretty soon, within the next couple weeks. So I got to know Dr. John Vervaeke through his interaction with Jordan Peterson, who many of you probably know. They actually were at the University of Toronto together in the psychology department, and so they've been interacting with each other for many years. And when I saw his work, or rather when I saw his conversation with Jordan Peterson, I realized that this is a person who has some serious ideas, and so I started to listen to his lectures, and I thought they were very useful. Now, of course, he's not Christian. He is something like a naturalist, Neoplatonist. So he's and he's a cognitive scientist, and he's actually a scientist and has done research and published papers. So of course he's coming at many of these questions from a very different point of view that from us. But his work is very useful, and I have found him to be an extremely genteel, polite, and kind person. Apart from our published conversations, we've also had some private conversations. And he's not hostile to religion in any way. Even if he doesn't believe in any traditional religion, but his focus really is the meaning crisis, identifying and explaining what the meaning crisis is, how it arose, and how we can, what tools we can have both on a societal and a personal level in order to escape from it, or he says awake from it, awaking from the meaning crisis. So, and I guess from his point of view, if insofar as religion can offer those tools, so much the better. And that's kind of what I've been trying to present in my conversations with him. Basically, the way that Orthodoxy has a unique perspective, distinct from Protestantism and Catholicism, which can help us to awake from the meaning crisis, or to find some meaning in our lives. So I've been really happy with our talks. They're very pleasant and very stimulating talks, and I hope that it will continue.
Well, thank you for having them, and then I guess we should be thanking him for sharing them, with the greater audience, because I know a lot of people have enjoyed them. We did have a question come in from our virtual audience. They write, for some people it feels extremely meaningful to live near family or to have a good job that supports their family, and it requires a compromise of their participation in the life of the church. When considering the hierarchy of meaning, what practices can we engage in to build discernment when faced with prioritization between two genuinely important aspects of our personal and spiritual life?
That for some people is a very important question, a very pertinent question. Of course, we do have to balance these different aspects of our lives, job, family, church, so whatever our pursuits are in our free time. We need all of these elements in our lives, and we do in fact need to balance them. And for some people it's not easy, because their job, wherever their work is not near to a church, or maybe they don't have a good job, and so they need to work really long hours, which means they don't have any time to spend with their family. These conflicts are always arising in life. And in order to figure out what is the best way, you really need, I don't think there's just one solution. There's not just one rule you can follow that will solve all your problems. I really think you need to think about it yourself, in order to see what is actually going to work in your life. You may have to play around a little bit with doing a little bit of this, a little bit of that, in order to see, what bears the best results. Certainly, as Christians, you would need to pray to God about it, to enlighten you, to show you what is the best way to balance these elements, and where you ought to live, and how much time you should spend doing one thing or another. And you should speak with your spiritual father, speak with maybe with close friends, whose insight you value. I think you need all of these things. There's not just one thing that you do that's going to give you the answer, because these are such complex questions, and they can be really hard to determine. I mean, and I've seen it go both ways. I've seen people who thought that they needed a particular job or who thought that they needed to spend such and such time with their family, and as a result, they ended up not going to church very often, and ended up actually straying completely from the church. I've seen it the other way as well. People who, thought that they needed to be with the church all the time, and they, as a result, they didn't get themselves a good job. Because they didn't have a good job, they didn't have any money. The fact that they didn't have any money caused them all sorts of problems in their lives, with where am I going to live, and what am I going to eat, and this caused stress within the families, so that everybody was at people's throats. And clearly the end result in a case like that was counterproductive, even spiritually, in spite of the fact that apparently they were putting the spiritual in the highest level. So there's no easy solution. It has to be, all of the factors have to be weighed in, and I think we need careful thought, sincere, honest, humble prayer to God without putting conditions on him, talking with our spiritual father, talking with other people, and so forth, in order to come to whatever is the best solution. And sometimes there's no good solution. You just need to choose the least of the evils that are presented to you. But that's life, and we have to deal with the challenges that life presents us, and God honors the fact that we are struggling to make the right decision when we understand these different priorities, which are genuinely good things in our lives. He honors that, and he knows the difficulty, and he takes it all into account, and he will bless us if we try to do the right thing.
Okay, at this point in time, I'd like to invite everyone to give a round of applause to His Grace. I want to remind everyone on our virtual audience that if you enjoyed today's talk, on Monday and Tuesday of this upcoming week, we will be having all of our classes and lectures available for participation through Zoom. You should have gotten an email already, but we'll be sending out an additional email. So this is part of our conference. We also have another special event that is being streamed live on Monday night at 6 o'clock Pacific time. Dr. Dimitri Alibertis will be having his book release. We're very excited, and it's a privilege for the seminary to host this event. So we want to make sure that you mark your calendars this Monday at 6 o'clock. I hope everyone will be joining us. I would be remiss at this point in time to not take a moment and thank all of our donors and benefactors that have made events such as these possible. Through their support and generosity, we not only have been able to invest in technology that allowed for you, Your Grace, to join us virtually for this event, but in general, that this institution continues to grow and flourish and provide the opportunity for people that are seeking meaning in their life through growing in their faith, in their formation, and ultimately, God willing, will return to their communities and serve their communities and find meaning and realize meaning in their service to the church. So again, everyone that supports the seminary, whether it be financially through their donations or through their prayers and enthusiasm and goodwill, a good word has great meaning When you're struggling or you might be a little discouraged and you have homework, we oftentimes get messages of support, cheering on our students, as well as a lot of prayer requests. And I know our students find great meaning in that type of connection. So thank all of you. For those that are here present, we're going to have a break at 4 o'clock. We have dinner scheduled, so please join us in the dining hall upstairs for dinner, after which the next event, or we'll have the festal vespers at the monastery, so for tomorrow's feast day of St. Photios the Great. So with that being said, is there anything else? No? Okay, Your Eminence, can we have a closing prayer?
Thank you again, Your Grace. Through the prayers of our Holy Fathers, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on us and save us.
Master, Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen.
I mean, thank you.